It's hard to believe that the 2022 SDG Action Zone is almost over. But one of the joys of nearing the end of these 3 incredible days is getting to hear the thought leaders and changemakers we respect reflect on the standout moments. Who better to have that conversation than someone who was instrumental in setting the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, including the Sustainable Development Goals? We're honored to have her with us, UN Deputy Secretary General Amina J. Mohammed. And joining the DSG to highlight his key takeaways and consider where we go from here is an Australian humanitarian who, as co-founder of Global Citizen, has received international praise for his work mobilizing resources to reduce extreme poverty in developing countries and advancing the SDGs. I'm delighted to welcome UN Deputy Secretary General Amina J. Mohammed in conversation with the CEO of Global Citizen, Hugh Evans.
Hi Hugh, welcome back to the UN.
Thank you so
It's great
much.
to see you after we have been away Zooming and teaming for so long, and now we get to be together. It's all, in person, and we've got hundreds of people in our halls. But today we get a chance to talk to you about the work that you've been doing with us, mobilizing the world behind our global goals, making a global citizen out of everyone, and that's been tough, I imagine, in the last couple of years where we have been so, would it be disconnected, yet very much connected online. So last 2-3 years, what have been your thoughts and how are we doing?
Well, it's interesting, Amina, and firstly, thank you so much for inviting me to be with you today, and thank you to everyone at the United Nations. When the pandemic first struck, my initial reaction was just, in addition to the terrible health consequences, I actually thought existentially for Global Citizen, because the festival was not going to happen in Central Park anymore. I was thinking, okay, what on earth do we do? And it was actually a few days later when Dr. Tedros called and said, could we mobilize young people around the world through One World Together at Home to start getting people in the virtual environment to start taking action, that I started to see how the model that we'd built in the real world that you were so instrumental in for so many years could actually go online, at least for the short term. It was interesting. There was this period where for a moment, everyone was prepared to go online. And that's when One World Together at Home mobilized $127 million for the World Health Organization, and Lady Gaga really championed that. And then there was this period of Zoom fatigue where no one wanted to go online anymore. And we started to see that had a huge effect on how people were engaging in action taking. But what we've seen now, which is really encouraging, is coming to the tail end of the first phase of the pandemic, we're now seeing that action taking is up like never before. In fact, this year in Central Park, where our actions are up 60-70% over last year, which is phenomenal. It just shows that people are willing to re-engage with the world again. And so I think while it was okay to go online temporarily, then when people became fatigued by that and weren't really willing to engage, it's now amazing that the real world engagement has driven up action taking like never before.
And that's really important because, again, here we come, we're back together again, connecting online as much fatigue as we got. We reached audiences everywhere. Where we wouldn't have actually done so on the ground. And now they're the same audiences that you talk about that are igniting this. We've got a number of crises. I mean, it started with how do we build back better from COVID?
Right.
Really difficult, mostly a socioeconomic challenge. Then we had the climate crisis that became more evident, more extreme, and then catastrophe of all catastrophes, we had the war in Ukraine. And we're dealing with all of these things, and yet we're having so much giving. Where are the areas that you're seeing there's the most giving to?
Well, it's really interesting because you're right. When the world is faced by a confluence of crises, how do you get mind share? Because, COVID-19 obviously pushed everyone to global health, and then the war in Ukraine pushed everyone towards refugees, and then now the climate crisis, as you say, is looming, and the United States is still lagging so far behind other donor countries in terms of its commitment to fulfilling the Paris Climate Change Accord. What we're finding these days is, particularly amongst young people, that climate and gender are the two biggest motivators. So all of our data that we're seeing from young global citizens around the world is that the climate crisis and fighting for gender equity are the two most enlivening SDGs, the ones that get them out of bed and make them go, okay, I'm going to take passionate, urgent action on these. The amount of young people we find that just will happily call themselves a climate activist when they're in their early teens, they'll live that brand, that identity year round is just phenomenal. It's happening everywhere around the world. But equally, we're finding that because, partly because of the Me Too movement, partly also because I think, there's been, this is the good thing about the gender movement is it isn't a north-south movement, it's everywhere. When you saw, Stop SARS violence in Nigeria, or you saw action for menstrual hygiene across South Africa, this is a movement that's taking young people by storm everywhere around the world. And so I think that's where we're seeing this. It's become definitely a case of those twin issues being the most igniting by far. How about you? What's your perspective?
I think it's the same, but I think it's because they're touchy-feely, right? I'm a climate activist. I see the damage of climate, but I also see the things I've been told I can do. I can get involved with adaptation. I can and we can unpack that word adaptation, and maybe it's the food system transformation and how we're going to do much more technology and producing food and getting it to the table and changing the diets. It's very real, and you can feel what you can do. Yes. And then you can say, well, that actually has and makes a difference in the lives of women and girls. And that becomes an outcome of these so many things that we want to do. Well, in the UN, we've seen much more women's leadership in decision making, in leading our agencies. That's had a difference to the kind of ideas that we've brought to the table.
That's awesome.
And what we've seen with young people, I mean, to your point that they have become so much more engaged, we've given them some kind of hook, I think, with the SDGs, and being able to find one that actually hits many of the goals. So if you take up climate action, it will do many things for pollution. So your life on land, underwater, it'll do the lot. And we've seen at the Transforming Education Summit, 70% of the people walked in the room were young.
Yeah,
and they were making demands. You didn't have to ask them. They had a declaration, and they were saying that goes on the table in the final. They're creating a movement afterwards. The same thing for the Africa business initiative that we pulled together. It was young people in the room.
Yeah, I've got to say, I love that. Well done.
It was
brilliant.
Well, lastminute.com, but it happened. And I think that's what find the ideas and listen to them. And in a number of cases, we give them the agenda.
Right.
I think we've stopped saying, let's prepare the agenda and invite youth. It's to say, you've got 3 hours, what do you want to do with it? And then they'll say, well, actually, we need 6.
Yeah.
Okay, they've negotiated, and they put their stuff on the table. So I see an intergenerational transition coming now, in that we're able to work better together for it. But look, we've gone halfway through. Next year will be a big stock take of the SDGs.
Right.
And so here on in, this drumbeat that has got to roll for us to get the SDGs back on track, because they have been knocked off by the various crises. We have to mobilize. How do you think we could mobilize 1 billion people in the next year to hit actions that would be demonstrated as moving the needle when we come to do a stock take in September next year?
Well, I often think that the way to mobilize at scale is, it's important to think about mobilization in a couple of different ways. You've got the traditional broadcast platforms, and if you can get, and by the way, it happens very rarely, happens only in very rare moments of crisis, like COVID-19. In fact, the example I gave earlier of One World Together at Home was the only global broadcast that was seen in both China, Russia, and the United States during the pandemic. The only one. And so it's extremely hard to reach all corners of the planet at once, but you can through those key moments. So I think there's an opportunity next year, under the UN mandate, to go to every nation all at once and get all the broadcasters involved. That's the first way. The second way, which is more long-term, is the platform approach. And the platform approach says to Facebook and to Twitter and to TikTok, who are themselves having existential crises right now, because People are blaming them because not just the attention economy, but the effect they're having on creating an echo chamber of information. And often that information isn't good information. And so they need actually to work closer with Global Citizen, closer with the United Nations on actually helping, how do you leverage either their platforms or they create a parallel platform that has a much bigger impact on actually getting out the right information. Now, historically, when young entrepreneurs have tried to create a parallel platform, it's always failed. Why? Because it's extremely hard to change people's existing habits. You know, if you're already on Instagram, the chances of you adopting Snapchat are limited, right? If that's your home. And so the better way to do it is to say to those platforms, and you've got to negotiate at arm's length, how do you actually get enough people to register either through a third-party app or in a way that actually integrates with their platform? And so most people, because everyone likes to say, let's create the Facebook for social good, it doesn't really work like that. You know, even Tim Hughes, who founded Facebook with Mark Zuckerberg, put hundreds of millions of dollars of his own money into this platform and it fell over for that reason. Causes on Facebook fell over, same reason. And so I would say, let's go for a broadcast, but let's negotiate with the platforms. And then you can get 1 billion people because you can't, I mean, obviously Facebook's one of the only platforms on the whole planet that has over 1 billion users alongside Alibaba's and Tencent's platforms as well. But to get that sort of scale, you have to negotiate with the platforms at arm's length. We can do it. And I think that's really, we had this fascinating conversation at the Global Citizen Board a few days ago about how the next phase of our growth could involve that sort of approach.
It's going to be really important because we still go out and you put a mic in front of someone and say, how about the SDGs or the global goals? And there's a blank look. So how to socialize more what these mean in everyday lives and how they can create their own movements in their countries to move this. You look at 3 points. You look at Africa at 1.3 billion, India just over 1 billion, and China. And between that, you would find if you got the right issue and followership, that would be it. You would ignite it.
Exactly.
But there are so many other places in the world where you want to get to because we have that leave no one behind. And when we get to the SDGs halfway through next year, it will be about, so how many girls did we get into school and how many boys did we leave behind?
Right.
How many of those that were pushed into poverty did we find a way to leapfrog and get them back in again because they could become entrepreneurial and go onto a platform online and begin their businesses? So bringing the doings that happen in Global Citizen, how do you think that we can amplify the inspiration from those actions that are done into a place where people can then multiply them, the scale at which we have to go? So not just the people on board, but the scale of the activities that now become the transformation and transition to a renewable energy piece.
Yeah. So there's kind of 2 parts, I think, to this question. The second part I'll start with first is really just about how do activists' ideas go to scale? The first part to your question is kind of a messaging question, which is, you know, Richard Curtis, who we both work closely with, has done so much work with you on making the goals famous, right? And so I guess the question comes, do you want the goals themselves to be famous, or do you want the issue areas that the goals represent to be famous? Because both those things are slightly different. And then I think the second part of it is, okay, so let's take, I think climate is probably the best example because it affects everyone in equal measure. We found when we worked with a group of young activists in South Africa on It's Bloody Time campaign, it was focused around menstrual hygiene issues. You know, when you find, it happens very rarely, but you get this moment where you get a group of passionate young activists, you lend them your platform. In this case, we gave them the Global Citizen platform. We got Beyonce attached to it. It was this perfect storm. And then we were able to get so many phone calls through to Cyril Ramaphosa's office. He had to unplug the phones from, you know, he wasn't even able to use the South African phone lines anymore.
Minister of Health talked about it.
Exactly. And I think that's the sort of thing we need to do on climate change. I think that for too often, activists like to think that their job ends at pointing the finger. You know, you're not doing X, you're not doing Y, that's enough. That's nowhere near enough. I would call that more an act of self-righteousness rather than being an effective activist. I think the true activism comes where you move the decision maker, like what Mandela did. He moved the decision maker who fundamentally disagreed with him to be forced into a position. He did it both peacefully and through some forms of violence that didn't harm others. He chose to use violence that disrupted the economy of South Africa to make it ungovernable. That was his approach. And I think, you know, there are rooms for all types of protest. But my view is that we haven't done enough to hold world leaders accountable to the promises that they've already made under Paris.
Yeah.
So take US, for example. If it truly is an issue of a few congressmen blocking $11 billion in additional climate financing, that's actually highly targetable. We can find those members of Congress, we can all spend time in their states, and we can change their policies. That's where I would spend time as a climate activist, and I would take the same approach globally.
To many, many leaders, and many of them have to make choices, and we did this with climate when we were going after mitigation. So who are the emitters?
Right.
They're all in the G20, 83% of them. And, you know, even within that, so who's doing 30%, who's doing 10%, who's doing 5%?
Exactly.
And you go after them, and you have those movements that, and public mobilization that can do that. To your question of issues versus the goals, it is about the issues that deliver on the goals.
Exactly.
And if we can do that, and we can say that in 2023 from today, we moved on these issues of climate, of gender, of jobs, and we can report on that and say this is how the goals met their targets.
Exactly.
And these are the indicators we used, and we can prove it, that lives were changed. But, well, Hugh, thank you very much. I know that we are, this is to be continued. In a couple of days, we will invade.
You're going to be with 60,000 people.
We're going to invade people in Central Park yet again, which is always a delight. And just thank you for what you're doing. And it's amazing, and we are mobilizing, and people are feeling it. And the SDG moment is here again.
Thank you so much, Amina.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, here we are in the home stretch of this year's SDG Action Zone. And if you're anything like me, you're feeling more than a bit reflective. What we just heard alone from two people who've both been instrumental in making global citizens out of so many of us was full of deep lessons. Global Citizen CEO Hugh Evans said true activism comes when you move the decision maker. And it goes beyond pointing fingers. In the words of Deputy Secretary General Amina Mohammed, it's about the work change makers do mobilizing the world behind our global goals, and taking heart in the fact that even in a time of so much crisis and catastrophe, there's so much giving too. All this speaks to the passion real people feel for the global goals and the issues they represent, which has been on full display in the Action Zone throughout this day of climate conversations. Economist Kate Rayworth brought her infectious energy to her session on donut economics, describing the need for an aligned economic model as, quote, the art of household management. There could be nothing more important in the world right now, Kate said, than the art of managing our planetary home in the interests of all her inhabitants. And households weren't the only apt analogy today either. Catherine McKenna, Canada's former Environment Minister, took us to school in our sit-down with her. Catherine called for corporations and other non-state actors to face consequences if they fail to meet their commitments, just the way students get graded on their performance in class. You cannot say you are a champion in climate, she said, if you are not making sure that your investments are going to support real people who need it, to renewable energy and not fossil fuels. And the truth is, neither can we. Whether it's our pensions, our insurance, where we bank, or who supplies our energy, we're making choices every day that also have real potential climate consequences. But when we make good decisions, good things happen. As UN Energy co-chair Damilola Agunbi pointed out in the opening plenary when she called for renewable energy investments in the Global South, and specifically in Africa. Moving cleaner, she said, moving greener actually helps the economy. Like everything else, though, we have to make those moves thoughtfully. In the local segment of our general panel on adaptation and mitigation, Ecuadorian human rights activist Elena Gualinga stressed the need to protect indigenous peoples during the green transition. And SDG advocate Hindu Ibrahim pushed us to center indigenous communities, young people, and women in these movements, and more importantly, to look to them for leadership. I know I, for one, felt like I was seeing that leadership firsthand with the young climate activists in our closing plenary. From Shie Bastida reminding us to, quote, live in a world where if we take, we need to give back, to Sophia Kiani showing us how something as simple as translating climate knowledge into different languages can effect radical change. But we have to take radical risks, too. NASA climate scientist Peter Kalmus was with us speaking on his own behalf, because speaking out about the climate crisis and against the ills of the fossil fuel industry is so urgent that it's worth putting his livelihood on the line. It is, as he plainly put it, literally life or death. In truth, as we barrel toward 2030, I don't think it's too controversial to say that's the attitude we need to bring to all 17 SDGs. Throughout these 3 days in the Action Zone, I've heard it in our speakers' voices, in our performers' voices, in your voices. From those stark opening moments with Secretary General Antonio Guterres, to Nasreen Sheikh telling us to choose love, to wear love, and reject suffering, not in some abstract sense, but literally in the clothes we put on our bodies. To MIT's Catherine D'Ignazio reminding us of all the data we aren't gathering, data that could save lives and change minds. To ILGA World's Martin Karajov, practically speaking for everyone when he said, we don't have the privilege of time. And today, to hear that we are simply not on track to keep 1.5 alive, that in fact, we're most certainly on track to blow right through that would-be ceiling. What can we call this but a moment of urgent existential reckoning? Here's the thing though, I think Luisa Neubauer, who's of course a young German climate activist and so much more, was also right today when she said that one of our biggest enemies is despair. And strangely, hearing the harsh realities stated so plainly over these 3 days hasn't made me despair. If anything, it's made me ask myself, more sincerely than ever, just what I'm willing and able to bring to this struggle, the way Microsoft President Brad Smith encouraged us all to do as he talked today about his company's own path to an unprecedented climate commitment. I'm still unraveling my real answer, and I'll probably be doing that for a while, but I'll tell you what came to mind right away. If it isn't obvious because of this lovely virtual frame, I'm having a baby in about 6 weeks. And I'll tell you that when the folks at the SDG Strategy Hub reached out to me a few months ago to ask if I'd join the Action Zone team again, this whole pregnancy thing was very much top of mind. It seemed almost irresponsible to take on something as big as this awesome program, knowing what the circumstances would be. Then, I hung up the phone, and guess what happened? I imagined this little human that's coming, and I thought about every child set to inherit a planet in crisis, and every pregnant person who won't get the support they need in this increasingly hostile political environment, and every corner of the world being left behind because those of us with even the slightest privilege are taught to chase comfort and convenience above everything else, including community. I thought about the example that's been set for me by a legion of unstoppable women in particular, and the example I want to set, the example we should all be setting for the next generation, as well as the generations above us, who still have so much power to do good, if they were brave and motivated enough to wield it. It didn't take long to figure out that there was nowhere in the universe I'd rather be, at 34 weeks pregnant, than sitting in this chair. Turns out that's something I'm more than willing to do. And though it's a tiny example, it feels like so many moments we all face. Moments big and small that offer us an opportunity to push ourselves, to be and to do just better. When we consider the people we might affect and how much making that impact is worth to us, it's amazing how easy it becomes to choose better, even when it's also harder. And I promise you there are more and bigger examples of that everywhere once you start looking. 50 years ago, it was saving the whales. American researcher Roger Payne stumbled across Navy recordings of whales and decided the world needed to hear them. So he produced an album called Songs of the Humpback Whale, which ultimately sold more than 100,000 copies and helped bring about the end of commercial whaling. Last week, it was the billionaire founder of Patagonia, Yvon Chouinard, announcing that he and his family were relinquishing ownership of the company they spent nearly half a century building. Earth is now our only shareholder, he said, as he pledged to put future Patagonia profits toward fighting climate change. Today, happening as we speak, it's climate strikers around the world demanding that leaders listen to the most affected people and areas and immediately work to provide loss and damage finance to the communities most harmed by the climate crisis. And beyond today, tomorrow, it's going to be you. Wherever you are, whatever your age, whether you're new to these causes or a lifelong champion and ally, I know it's going to be you. I know it's going to be you because it has to be you. And I'm so grateful on behalf of this baby and all the babies who are going to be able to live full, happy lives because we held ourselves to account and made the choices we had to make. It's going to be us leveraging our sense of urgency, our ingenuity, and our humanity to spark transformational change. And we're going to do it with complete and total intersectional joy, just like LGBTIQ activist Anbid Zaman said yesterday. So remember, the Action Zone is just the beginning, a springboard to get you connected and collaborating, so we can convince the world together to act. And in that spirit, it's up to you to spread the message. So here's something you can do right now. Go to sdgactionzone.org. Choose the session that excited you the most and share it far and wide. And of course, don't forget those hashtags, which for the final time are hashtag SDG Action Zone and hashtag For People for Planet. If these leaders and activists and artists moved you, if their stories stirred something in you, honor their work with your own. And know that we're here working right alongside you. Because the Action Zone may be nearly over, but the fight never ends. And all that said, it's my pleasure, finally, to turn it over to the global head of the SDG Strategy Hub, the irrepressible and audacious Dauda Jabarte, for some very special thank yous.
The SDG Action Zone is your space to showcase the power of innovative, necessary action to accelerate the Sustainable Development Goals. Once again, it's been our absolute pleasure and privilege to welcome the champions, activists, and allies of sustainable development from around the world. That's all of you. And none of this could have been possible without the dedication, enthusiasm, collaboration from each and every one of you from across the globe, including our committed network of UN colleagues. So we want to express our sincere gratitude to all of those who have made this possible. Thank you to the Secretary General and the Deputy Secretary General and your teams for once again setting the ambition of the SDG Action Zone so high and for entrusting us to deliver on that vision. Thank you to the SDG Strategy Hub organizations, both within and beyond the UN system, for sharing with us your collective intelligence to curate an ambitious, productive, and inclusive program, and for inviting your vast communities to participate. Thank you to all of the speakers and performers for lending us your powerful voices, and more importantly, for doing the critical work to get the SDGs done. During the last 3 days, you've raised the bar and highlighted the urgent transformations needed to get us to a more equitable and sustainable future. Thank you, as always, to the virtual show for an impeccable production, and to TBWA Melbourne for beautiful and compelling promotional material. And thank you both for your continued collaboration. Thank you to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, to Education Above All, and to the UN Foundation for enabling this space through your generous support. And lastly, but certainly not least, thank you to the team behind the SDG Action Zone. Nadira, our brilliant host, for leading us through the program. Christian, the man behind the camera, for bringing the program to life. Charlie and Christina, for the powerful words. And to the small, mighty, and determined SDG Strategy Hub team, Natalie, Nora, Agustin, and Monique, thank you. To Anne-Marie, and to the entire UN Office for Partnerships, thank you. We couldn't have done this without each and every one of you, and for that we are eternally grateful, so thank you. We now turn back to you, our SDG Action Zone champions and allies. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for engaging on social media. Thank you for everything you do. Thank you for everything you will do to take action on the SDGs, to raise accountability, to drive impact around the world. Thank you for joining the SDG Action Zone. Let's get it done.
And that's a wrap from the 2022 SDG Action Zone. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Let's keep doing the work, and we'll see you next year.